For any of you wondering why I reviewed Tank Wars before this game, well, here's part of the reason. Today in Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at one of the most identifiable artillery games ever produced, Scorched Earth. To say this game set the standards for future artillery games would actually be a blatant lie. There's really only a tiny number of games after Scorched Earth that use a similar formula. Actually, Scorched Earth itself suffers from an incredibly unusual problem that's usually only reserved for RPGs. It has way too many features. Normally you'd think that'd be a good thing, but it lends itself to a situation where many combinations of settings simply don't make for good gameplay. On the other hand, lots of people like being able to tweak the heck out of things, so Scorched Earth ends up being a game you either love profusely or hate with a passion. I'm one of the latter, but I'll try to give this game the props it deserves because a whole generation of DOS gamers were raised on this. And it's not that it's a bad game, I just don't like it that much. I mean, it happens. Anyways, let's get the game stats out of the way. Scorched Earth was created and released in 1991 by Wendell Hicken, who's also known as Sprig, though version 1.50, the version most people are going to be familiar with, was released in 1995. It's a 0 to 10 player artillery game that supports a wide variety of 256 color video modes, but only has PC speaker sound support. The lowest resolution supported is its VGA 320x200 mode, and the highest is its SVGA 1024x768 mode. Unfortunately, it doesn't support every mode you can think of between those limits, not that you'd really want it to, because the higher you set the resolution, the harder it is to see everything, so I recommend using the 640x480 SVGA mode. As for its current release date, it's still shareware, but trying to get the registered version is a bit perplexing, since there's no current information anywhere about what you're supposed to do to get it. I tried to get in touch with the author, but the email address on his website doesn't work anymore, so I don't know. At least the download for the shareware version still works, and the registered version is barely any different anyway, so if you want to get the shareware version, just head on over to www.whicken.com/scorch, and there you go. So just like any artillery game, Scorched Earth follows the same basic format. You have various tanks and fixed emplacements trying to incinerate each other. But rather than pointing and shooting, you have to angle your turret, set a power level to determine how fast your shot goes, then fire and pray that the wind and gravity work in your favor. But what really got people to notice Scorched Earth was its features, and holy jeez does this game have a lot of features. It would take forever to explain how every little slider and setting affects the game, so I'm not even going to try. Most artillery games up to this point didn't really have much going for them, short of aiming and shooting. They didn't have different weapons, they didn't have collapsing landscapes, most of them didn't even allow more than 2 players, so artillery games up to this point were pretty boring for the most part. Except for Tank Wars, the one I reviewed back in episode 36, since Scorched Earth seems very much inspired by that game, right down to the shape of one of the fixed emplacements, and the inclusion of similar entities, such as a horizontal and vertical guidance systems, and the fountain-like explosions. Yeah, Tank Wars not only predates Scorched Earth, but it was freeware, and people tend to forget Tank Wars existed because of an earlier game of the same name that doesn't have anywhere near the same feature set. So for all the people who call something a Scorched Earth clone, Scorched Earth itself is technically a Tank Wars clone, though despite its similarities, they really are completely different games. For one thing, battles in Scorched Earth tend to last a lot longer than they would in Tank Wars. And there's a few reasons for this. The first reason is because the landscapes are much bigger and usually have really deep and erratic hills, so as a result, it takes a lot longer to get shots where you want them to go. Secondly, the weapons themselves don't destroy as much of the landscape as you'd expect them to, so if you need to tunnel past a little hill or something, it can take a while. Lastly, the AI in this game is not very good. The AI comes in several flavors: morons, shooters, pool sharks, tossers, choosers, spoilers, cyborgs, and unknowns. Morons just shoot anywhere. Shooters also just shoot anywhere unless they have a direct full power shot towards their target. Pool sharks are shooters who like to use rebounding walls. Tossers are again like morons on their first shot, but then slowly change their shot up until it hits their target. Choosers are like a cross between a tosser and a pool shark. Spoilers are a significant jump in difficulty as their aim is almost perfect. Cyborgs are basically vengeful, opportunistic spoilers. And finally, unknowns are any of these, but the game never tells you which. Now, did you notice something about those choices? Yeah, you basically have 5 choices that can barely play the game at all, 2 choices that will play the game perfectly unless certain settings get in the way, in which case they play the game even worse, and you have 1 choice which just randomly chooses one of the other 7 choices. Yeah, the AI in this game is terrible, often glitching out since it can't handle certain boundary types properly, and has a tendency to fail to correct itself if it overcompensates. I highly recommend playing this game with other people rather than with the computer. Out of the 5 games I recorded for this episode, only 1 of them actually reached a conclusion. The other 4 all got glitched out because the AI decided to be stupid, one of which lasted only 2 rounds before that happened. Not to mention, the AI doesn't really use any of the weapons beyond missiles, nukes, and dirt. Though speaking of the weapons, that's one aspect of the game that works pretty well, as the selection is massive, and everything you can choose from tends to have a certain purpose. I'm not going to cover all of them, but I am going to talk about some of the more interesting ones. The rollers are by far one of the best weapons to have on hand in this game. When a roller hits a surface, it starts rolling, either down a hill, or if it lands on a flat surface, it continues on in the direction it was fired in. Once the roller hits an incline or another tank, it explodes, and since all direct hits with a warhead in this game are fatal, even the baby rollers can easily pick off targets right beside a steep mountain or rolling hillside with little need for accuracy. The sandhogs are kind of unique, but not very useful. Essentially, when they hit the ground, they send special warheads through the ground that explode when they exit to a surface. If they happen to hit a tank when they exit, it's an instant kill, even if it's got a shield up, since the shield isn't going to penetrate through to the ground. But you have to be really lucky to hit anything with these weapons, and there's always a slight chance you might hit yourself. The multiple impact re-entry vehicles, i.e. MIRVs, are not programmable in this game like they are in Tank Wars, but otherwise function as you would expect. Though when the warhead splits, they don't scatter very far apart, so the MIRVs essentially work to blanket a target area with warheads. The Death's Head is essentially the same thing, just with about quadruple the power, having twice as many warheads and larger explosions on impact. My favorite weapon in this game, though, is the Napalm. And unlike many games where Napalm weapons just spew fire, in this game, Napalm is liquefied, just like it should be. When a Napalm weapon hits anything in this game, even shields, it oozes out and creates a puddle of molten death that lights on fire and will severely burn anything it comes into contact with. If you pile up enough of this stuff on top of someone's shield, even if it's at maximum intensity, it's going down. The only trouble is that if the napalm warheads are moving fast enough, they can bury themselves in the dirt and end up fizzling before they can spread. So if you're going to use napalm, you also got to make sure to keep a stock of contact triggers. These trigger a weapon to go off the instant they touch the dirt, no matter how fast they're going. Now, one of the most beloved things about this game are the shields. There are 5 different kinds of shields, 4 of which are completely unbalanced. Now, seriously, apart from the mag deflector, which just pushes shots upwards, all the basic shields in this game absorb direct hits as just minor damage, even going so far as to prevent warheads from exploding. What I mean is, if you hit a standard shield with a baby missile, it does 10% damage to the shield. If you hit a standard shield with a nuke, it does 10% damage to the shield. Yeah, once someone starts buying shields, if you're not prepared with weapons more powerful than baby missiles, you're in trouble. The thing is, while the shields are all ridiculously hardened against direct impacts, they are all very weak to splash damage, i.e. damage from a nearby explosion. So in order to take out an enemy's shield without having to hit it a few thousand times, you need to use weapons that deal splash damage, and baby missiles don't. Nukes are the simplest way to go, but you gotta make sure not to hit the shield directly. Napalm works very well with a direct hit, so long as there's some dirt nearby to help form a puddle against the shield itself. There's also a weapon called the Funky Bomb, which randomly spreads warheads all over the place that will explode on a direct impact with the shield. But they're very unpredictable and expensive, so they can't be used at close range and generally work best against multiple targets. Beyond the mag deflector, there's 4 kinds of shields. Standard shields, which can take 10 direct hits before falling. Force shields, which can take 5 times as many direct hits as a standard shield, but shots bounce off of these shields, possibly exposing the owner to splash damage. And they're also the most likely shield type to suffer a random failure, allowing a shot to pass straight through. Now, all the shield types can suffer these failures, but force shields suffer them far more frequently than the other types. Heavy shields are simply twice as thick as standard shields. Then finally we have the super mags, which combine a heavy shield with a mag deflector, thus making it even harder to hit the shield to begin with. There are also 5 guidance systems you can purchase for when you absolutely must hit a target. And I say it that way because using the guidance systems usually results in a net loss of money rather than a gain. Unless you're using the most basic one, the heat guidance system, which will cause your shot to swerve towards any target it gets close to. The ballistic guidance is supposed to be an automatic power calculator based on your firing angle and intended target, but I've never been able to get the thing to choose any power levels besides 1,000 and 0, so it either always misses or always kills you. The horizontal and vertical guidance systems will cause your shot to fly straight horizontally or vertically the moment it's in line with your target. Finally, there's the lazy boy guidance, which is basically point and kill, which is why it's so incredibly expensive. Speaking of expense, there's a few other neat features of this game, notably its free market system. Essentially, when playing with a free market, the prices of everything in the store fluctuates based on how much demand there is. If players are buying a lot of a particular kind of item, then that item will go up in price, but if no one's buying a particular kind of item, the price drops. In short games, this isn't going to make a huge difference, but in long games, this really helps to change things up because it can start to get prohibitively expensive to buy the most comfortable items to work with. If you're playing with an actual tank and not a fixed emplacement, you can actually buy fuel to move your tank across flatland or hills that aren't too steep, and your turn doesn't end for moving either. You can also buy batteries to restore lost power if you get damaged but not destroyed, and you can buy parachutes to deploy if you fall any great distances. You can also set a threshold for parachutes that if a fall is minor enough to your preference, a parachute won't be wasted. Now, it may sound like this game has lots of neat stuff to it, and it does indeed, but because of the lack of a good AI system, combined with the fact I could never get anyone to play this game with me, since everyone I knew preferred Tank Wars because it was simpler, I don't have fond memories of this game, and whenever I try to play it by myself, it's just absolutely boring, because the battles can take incredibly long, especially once shields come into play, because the AI just isn't that good, and you spend the entire game straining to see those tiny little tanks and their tiny little bullets. And I could have recorded the game at a lower resolution, but this game looks pretty ugly at low res. Heck, the GUI doesn't even work properly at 320 by 240 resolution. The last thing I'm going to mention is the triple turreted tanks. Now if you're playing the shareware version, you're going to notice the last tank you can choose from is grayed out for the human players, but selectable for computer players. Now, the last tank is known as the triple turreted tank since when it's firing standard or baby missiles, it can lob 3 of them at once, not just 1. The only way to gain access to this tank for human players is to register the game. And that's about the only perk for registering, aside from removing the little nag messages that pop up every now and then. There's still a plethora of features I could talk about, but as I said before, I'd be here forever if I tried to mention all of them, so I'm just going to cut things off here. Really, Scorched Earth is a party game, and it's a tweaker's game. You need to either really like tweaking numerous game settings, or have lots of other people to play it with, if you want to enjoy it. If you just want the game to work its best out of the box, or if you just want to play it solo, then I'd say stick with Tank Wars instead, or go with something more modern. Now, I'm not going to bring up the DOSBox settings this time around because the only thing you need to do is set the cycles count to a fixed value. However, the value you set should be based on how fast you want the in-game elements to go. Now, some people are going to want things to go by really fast, while some people would rather get a chance to watch stuff happen. I'm playing with the default in-game speed settings and a cycles count of 5,000. If you want the game to go faster or slower overall, then simply adjust the cycles count. But if you want certain elements of the game to go faster or slower, not the game as a whole, then you need to not only adjust the cycles count, but also the in-game speed settings. Anywho, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Stay tuned for episode 62, where we're going to take a look at the first game ever released by Epic Mega Games to feature MIDI music. If you think you know which game that is, then send your guess to ADG at pixelships.com and tune in next Saturday to check it out.